your lovely host, Monique Watson. This episode is going to be a little bit different than the last couple. I was thinking about it, and we're going to talk a bit about me. And so you, the listeners, those folks listening, thank you for listening if you're hearing this, to get to know who I am a little bit more, a little bit about my background. And so some may be wondering, if you're an avid listener of mine, where I've been. I've been a little off the map for a little bit since the last episode dropped. Had some personal health challenges, dealing with some shoulder injury and all this kind of stuff, and my birthday and things like that. 32, woohoo! So yeah, I've been a little off the day and things like that. 32, woohoo! So yeah, I've been a little off the map, but wanted to get back in and record an episode before the Thanksgiving season, and kind of in the mind of thankfulness and mindfulness and all this kind of stuff. Made me think, I got to get back into the podcast studio, aka at the kitchen table. So so this let me just lay out kind of this episode versus normal flow with interviews. It'll be just me, so if you're sick of hearing my voice, just hit the mute button, but let it play. I don't know. But I'll be talking a little bit about my background, both at a high level and then centering around two topics. Just when you introduce yourself and like, where are you from and what do you do and things like that. Top two questions. I'm from a native of New Orleans, or I consider myself a native of New Orleans. So I get asked about what my kind of Katrina story or Katrina experience in one way, shape, or form. That question gets asked inevitably, and fully understandable. And then the other side is the time I spent living in Canada. And I've talked a little bit here or there, especially in like episode 3 with my friend Vanda. If you haven't listened to that one, she's host of the Tight Ends podcast, which is a great podcast as well. That's where I met her, in Calgary as well. That's where I met her, in Calgary, Canada. So talking a little bit about that and that time and what it's like, and maybe some tips and tricks for those who maybe live or are moving to a new area, going through a place where you're away from your core group of family support or what have you, and help cope with it, or how I cope with it, and hopefully that helps you, right? This is all about us helping each other to become victorious, right? Victorious in our lives, careers, whatever it is. And then we'll wrap up with where you can find us. Of course, you can find us on the victorypodcast.com, all the social media links on there. You can also email me directly, Monique at thevictorypodcast.com. Always there. Definitely check that email, and if you have ideas, interviews, whatever. So we'll go through that in this episode, and hope you're along for the rest of the journey. Okay, so let's get into it. So yeah, I'm your host, Monique Watson. This is the Victory Podcast. And a little bit about me. I am born in Northern Virginia, just about an hour outside of D.C. Grew up there until about middle school. My family relocated to New Orleans, where my father's originally from. Lived there through middle school, high school, formative years, I would say. And then went to undergrad and back in the D.C. area, in Washington, D.C. actually, at a historically black college university in the category of HBCUs, as they're known in the United States. The college I went to is, the university I should say that I went to is Howard University, which is AKA the real HU, AKA the Mecca, all these kind of acronyms, nicknames, what have you. So I did that for undergrad, then went back home to New Orleans where my family was living, and went to grad school there in the New Orleans area. Did that at LSU and got my master's to working into industry. So my background is in environmental and occupational health sciences. So what does that mean? It's like an industrial hygiene, and know that it has nothing to do with washing and brushing your teeth and making people wash their hands. Those things are always important part of the public health side. But industrial hygiene or occupational health sciences, that kind of the public health side. But industrial hygiene or occupational health sciences, that kind of field that I'm in, is around protecting people in a work environment to the different things they could be exposed to, whether that's noise, chemicals, radiation, what have you, depending on the industry, indoor air quality in an office environment type thing comes up often. All of those things, measuring them, quantifying that, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and understanding how can we protect people, looking at the different ways to protect people. There's your personal protective equipment like safety glasses, gloves, bike helmet if you're thinking about I bike to work or I bike for my adventures. That's an example of personal protective equipment. Yeah, or it could be other things, engineering controls, separation, substituting one thing for something less hazardous, as far as employee hazards. So yeah, that's the kind of realm of as far as employee hazards. So yeah, that's the kind of realm of my background. So I started doing that in the oil and gas industry in the greater New Orleans area where, like I said, where I was living, where I was from. Then got the opportunity to move to Calgary, Canada, doing in the industry, a little bit different, more permits and compliance side of health and safety in that space. And then, yeah, in 2015, price of oil took a big dip at that time. And they started doing layoffs and layoffs getting closer and closer. And I looked at other opportunities outside of that industry, which tends to be quite volatile. I mean, any industry can have its ups and downs, but that's an especially volatile one. And looked at that my skills transfer to any place where anybody works, really. So got the opportunity to work out here in the Bay Area, which that's a reference to the San Francisco Bay in the state of California. So San Francisco Bay Area, been out here for 3 years now. So I'm out here with my husband, Christian. He has married for 2 years, together for about 7 years. So quite some time that we've spent together. And have 2 lovely dogs. If you want to follow them on the gram, it's the Chewy and Shorty Show. I try and throw up some cute, funny things. They have a lot of personality, even though they lay around other. So that's the overview, definitely. So inevitably, when I give that rundown about what I do, who I am, where I'm from, I get 2 buckets of questions, categories of information, whatever you want to say. Questions about, oh, you're from New Orleans. The very next thing is, were you there? And it's always a mixed reaction for me. I get the interest, but there's also a level of, for anyone, even if you weren't in New Orleans, you're adjacent to New Orleans, have family, and you have some connectivity to that city, there's different levels and peaks and valleys around that experience for people. So, I mean, it's whatever people are going to ask. I've learned to kind of not give them the quick and dirty usually and just kind of understand what that is. But I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of experience from my perspective, which is just mine and often. And I think I referenced this in some of the earlier episodes, so go back and listen. But it's similar to how I imagine people in New York or people from New York or who were in New York during 9/11. When that happened, it changes you. You know exactly where you were when you heard, you know what it took to kind of either come back or dealing with that and the after effects and things that have forever changed that city specifically and other cities that were affected on that day. So, yeah, it's very something is something that anybody from New Orleans will carry with them forever. And there's a pre-9/11 things we talk about and ways we talk about different topics, whether it be airport security or the state of the world or politics in a world of pre-9/11, post-Katrina. There's a fundamental shift for good, bad, or indifferent, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple minutes. So yeah, where was I? What's my Katrina story? So I wasn't in New Orleans at the time of Katrina. That was actually my freshman year in college. First week of classes, maybe it was the first week. Actually, my freshman year in college. First week of classes, maybe it was the first week of the pre-freshman orientation week to kind of really get excited about being and going to school at Howard. So in the loop, hurricane season is an inevitable part of the Gulf Coast where all that kind of area is in. So there's always some level of potential that a storm will affect your area. Oftentimes in my history, as far as in my lifetime, it would be minor. We get the outer bands of something because it goes east or west of us, or it misses us completely, east coast or what have you. And evacuating for a hurricane is, in my case, it was something we did. Some people did not because they're used to, crying wolf in a sense of there not being the big one in their lifetime, or because they survived the big one 40, 50, 60 years ago, what have you, that the big one 40, 50, 60 years ago, what have you, that they don't feel the need to evacuate. They feel ready to handle such a thing. And, that's a choice. That's absolutely a choice. And, maybe 9 times out of 10, that's not a problem. Because it turns into, I evacuated, nothing happened, I spent money. Because it turns into, I evacuated, nothing happened, I spent money, time. It turns into an evacuation vacation if you make it fun, depending on where you go and your financial ability to evacuate. All of those factors. So evacuating or hearing about people in my family evacuating was not an alarm bell for me. It was, okay, that's what we should do. Be safe. Let me know where you're going. Keep me in the loop. So I remember in the days leading up to the storm making landfall and all of that, my father called me and said that our family, our immediate family who was there, my younger sister, was evacuating. I said, okay, great. It was a little bit strange. So my grandparents, who were both alive at the time, and my grandmother is still alive. My great-grandmother is not, and my grandfather is not of this branch of the family. They evacuated, which was strange. They're of this branch of the family. They evacuated, which was strange. They're of that scenario, as I mentioned earlier, who didn't evacuate. They survived. I think in the early 60s, there was a hurricane in New Orleans, Hurricane Betsy, where there was flooding and a major whole thing, and people who survived that were like, well, I made it through Betsy, I'll be fine. That was kind of the mentality. Or, I'm older and it is what it is, what have you. I live in an elevated area, I'll be fine if we get some flooding. And to put in context, if anyone's not familiar with New Orleans in itself is, in essence, in a bowl. We sit below. I joke that if you tried to, dig, that's why our graves are above ground, all that kind of stuff. You try and dig out back to build out a basement, you're building a swimming pool because you'll inevitably run into water. We're surrounded by water in a sense. There's a river. The Mississippi River runs kind of through New Orleans. There's a river. The Mississippi River runs kind of through New Orleans. You have a Lake Pontchartrain, very large body of water that is in the New Orleans area. And then we're just off the coast. There's a lot of water around, all around. So, yeah, inevitably living in a bowl, there's a city before the country was a country. So French, Spanish, back to French to the United States, I think is the order of who owned what and what have you. Anyway, so certain parts of the city are higher on the edges of the bowl, and some are lower in the bottom of the bowl. The bottom of the bowl stuff is kind of, for whatever reason, when they were finding it, is areas closer, and often will get flooding depending on where you are, just the infrastructure and a whole host of things that I won't even begin to get into. Maybe more in the post-Katrina side of it once we get through that part of this conversation. But yeah, so they called me. They were evacuating, loading up the car. Both they got my grandparents to agree to evacuate. So that was a little bit like, okay, all right, well, be safe and do what you do. Pack a few things, secure the houses. A week, 2 weeks, whatever. Maybe there's some flooding, maybe some minor wind damage, what have you. Minor, I was expecting at most, and that was in my mind, a 5% chance of at most minor wind damage. So life goes on. I'm an undergrad and I'm a freshman and I'm in college and woohoo. And it's fun and exploring being in school. And this was early in the cell phone phase, pre no, was it pre-iPhone? Yeah, I'd say pre-iPhone really being a thing. Definitely, I didn't have smartphones, iPhones, what have you. Something was different. Not, I didn't have a TV in my room as a freshman. I didn't bring one, and my roommates didn't bring one. We were kind of like, meh, whatever. We had classes and all that kind of stuff, so it was fine. And there was common area TVs. So I didn't really keep up with the news that much. It didn't directly affect me. My family's evacuated my knowledge at that point. Yeah, so all good. And then my phone stopped working. And I still had a New Orleans-based phone, so it was on the same kind of however that works. And so it stopped working. But being in D.C., there's parts that are underground with the subway, so I assumed I was just in a bad zone. They're underground with the subway, so I assumed I was just in a bad zone or reception zone. So I got on my computer, my little laptop, got on my brother who had just started at A&T, had transferred. He's a year ahead of me as far as grades and such. And he had just transferred to North Carolina T out of the New Orleans area, out of another HBCU, whoop whoop, HBCU love. Sent him a note. It was like, hey, is your phone working? And he was like, this was on the AIM Instant Messenger. We thought we were cool. Whatever. So old school now. Anyway, so he sent me a note back like, no, it's not. I wonder what's going on with that. I was like, And so I kind of, what's going on? And I saw in the news and all the stuff that was emerging out of Katrina. And it was just, my stomach hit the floor, honestly. It was devastation that I had never seen. The amount of just unfortunateness of, I won't even blame on how it was handled. It was just the scope in which that couldn't be expected or prepared for. Because honestly, it was not, and what a lot of people who aren't from New Orleans are as intimately bad, that the storm hit, I believe, east or west, I think east of us as far as the eye of the storm. But it was really more so around the failures of the levees, which the levees hold back the water. Like I said, we're surrounded by water. There's the lake, there's the river, there's all these things, bodies of water around. The levees hold that back because we are below sea level to keep the sides of the bowl up, basically. And so when the levees breach, you have water's going to come into your bowl. So that's really, when the levees break, it's an engineering failure. You can't really plan for that. It was a time, like I said, there hadn't been a major hurricane in most people's lifetime. It happened, the last big one that had hit was in the 60s, as I mentioned, Hurricane Betsy. So people who were alive to really remember on how to plan. Cell phones, you get to rely, and especially in an emergency situation, emergency first responders rely on comms, right? You assume that you will have some level of communication. And that was really challenging. A family friend of mine was the police chief during that time, and he equated their ability and the communication situation in that time was like the movie Hotel Rwanda meets Black Hawk Down, but with no communication. So you're in the dark. There's no way to communicate with people. It's hard to coordinate your team and make sure your team is safe and how they can respond and be a first responder and fall into that step. So that's why places and groups of people and individuals who have boats and looking for people and checking for their neighbors, and the Cajun Army coming down from areas that were less affected, like Baton Rouge, to come and help, to start looking for people to help in the rescue efforts. So the human spirit that ultimately, when push comes to shove, regardless of what part of the world you're in, I honestly believe, and as a woman of faith, that this is just validated over and over and over and over and over and over and over throughout history of people coming together in times of trouble. So you put aside where we stand on the red or the blue or this thing or that issue. That goes out the window a lot of times to say, I'm going to help you as a human. Your humanity speaks to my humanity. I'm going to help you as a human. Your humanity speaks to my humanity. And we need to help to at least get you out of this dire state. What happens after that, That's its own bureaucracy and response, and we can go for round and round. Anybody who wants to talk about the politics of response and emergencies and how different governments respond more effectively than others, sure, we can talk about that, but that's not this podcast. So yeah, I looked at that, and then in my own, okay, what's my analysis of how my family is affected? Couldn't really cause some damage to where our family home was based on the news and where they're doing shots of. So for a number of days, you never really got a screen, and as were they, to find out, watching the news to find out the best information that they could. So you're watching the overheads of helicopter footage in parts of the city. You're like, that way, so maybe we're okay, because there are parts of the city that were affected more than others, based on their location relative to the levees. So for a while, I was like, okay, we're probably fine. It should be fine. We're in a higher part of the city. We're more up away from the bowl, directionally speaking, and should be fine. We sit up. Our house sits up a little bit, not terribly high, but we should be okay. And then they did like a helicopter angle of what was Six Flags, what is currently, as it stands at the time of this recording this podcast, is the abandoned Six Flags, was under significant amounts of water. And my family's home is not very far from there. So that was a really aha moment of, oh shoot, this is gonna not only affects the city, and this is a game changer. It's now a whole new world. Not only affects the city, and this is a game changer. It's now a whole new world. People are displaced all over, thousands of people displaced. People don't know when they're going to be able to get home, don't know where all their loved ones are. That speaks to, let me pause here for a second to say, that's important to think about regardless of where out here in the Bay Area, there's earthquakes, some places there's hurricanes, some places there's tornadoes. Having an emergency plan and having someone who doesn't live in your area, hopefully, that you can reach out to and be the point of contact. Because when something like that happens, communications are going to go down. You're not going to be able to get messages out from your smartphone better than it was in most places since Katrina and other disasters since. Facebook's out there with some great tools about checking in. But learning and having a plan to call someone and or text messages, as we learned, do get out. Even if the cell phone, as far as calling to talk to your family or loved ones, to say at 2:20 in my time zone, I'm safe, or I need help, or this is where I am, I'm at work, I'm on the highway, I'm on this part of the highway near this exit, whatever. Have a person outside of your area. The recommendation is 300 miles outside of your area, to be that point of contact so that family your area, to be that point of contact so that family that could be in that area that all live in that same space can reach out to that person and say, okay, I'm gonna text you this, check back, and be that hub of communication if all the communication around locally to the incident will be shut down or minimized, and prioritize first response and people who are in need, in dire need, first. So have a plan. If you want some tips and tricks, I'll put a couple of links in the show notes for this episode so that you can have that and share with your own families. That's when I realized it was going to be a big deal. And we really didn't know specifically the damage for a while, because getting into that area, getting to a point where the waters could recede, all of those things, it was outer bands, a lot of rain, and then other storms coming after it. It was several months before we even got any kind of pictures or anything of folks to see the damage in our home. And ultimately it was quite significant. I actually have a few photos. I won't share them necessarily. Maybe one or two. Well, I'll decide. Go check out the website. Maybe they'll be there. Maybe they won't. Like what I would say, about 3 feet worth of water in our home. We probably in that area had about 5 feet, but we sit up about 1.5 feet, 2 feet. We had about what I would say countertop level. If you think about the countertops in your home, that level of water in our house. And then the mold from water sitting there, mold uses drywall as a food source. The mold will grow. So we had another foot of mold probably, and that's just a rough estimate. of water damage on the first floor of our home. We're blessed to have a 2-story home. In some places, if you have that amount of water, that's most of your house and all of your belongings and what have you. But yeah, so a lot of damage, what have you. But yeah, so a lot of damage, pulling out drywall, all that kind of stuff. So that kind of devastation. It was a while. It was about almost a year and a half before we were back in our family home, as far as my parents and stuff. Of course, I was away from my core family, right? College is stressful for anybody who's been to college or lived away in any way. It's stressful. It's a different time. You're adjusting to a different phase of life. And to add on to that, this kind of emergency devastation, Howard was really good to do and help people. Who were from that area. They took in a lot of students who were in school in New Orleans there. Xavier University is another HBCU, which is in New Orleans. They took in several students from Xavier University, as did a lot of schools. Once again, that American human spirit, bit of let's all come together to do the greatest good, regardless of where you're from and what have you. A lot happened in that space. So trying to manage school and understanding that, it's definitely a stressful time. I tried my best to focus on what I could control at the time, eating, going to class, checking in and as I knew my family was safe, ultimately, it's like, look, at least they're safe. Stuff can be replaced. People are not replaceable. There's only one you in all of the world. Even if you're a twin, a triplet, there's only one you. So always remember that stuff can be replaced. Have the insurance that you need for the type of environment that you need, but ultimately things are things. I always recommend people, as much as you can have feelings about the cloud, it's nice to digitize, to have some sort of external hard drive. When you're making your emergency plans, take that stuff with you. Those mementos, those irreplaceable sides, but which is whatever. Items are replaceable for the most part, but you are never replaceable. There's only one you. So the next question is, what now? So the storm has happened. You're watching this on the news. To kind of put some context to a little bit of like a secondhand version of my parents' experiences as part of evacuating. They evacuated to my aunt's home in Houston, Texas, where she was living. And she was a physician and had a, decent sized home. Real estate's relatively inexpensive in Houston compared to other parts of the world in the country. All of, like I said, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandmother, my sister, and then a number of members of her husband's family. My aunt's husband's family is also from New Orleans, so they evacuated there. My aunt's husband's family is also from New Orleans, so they evacuated there. So you had 20 plus, I think, people living in the same house. Good-sized house, but not meant for 20 people. My parents' quote-unquote bed was like a pallet they made in the master closet of my aunt's home. So, it is, you get in where you fit in. The elder, I think, generation slept in, people giving up their beds. The kids bunked together on the floor, kind of camping style. The younger kids that belonged to my aunt, whatever, it kind of was get in where you fit in and kind of make do. Once again, the strength of the human situation, but you make do with what you got. The other challenge on their end that I heard about, so my aunt's a physician. She's in anesthesiology, more specialized, but she kind of switched gears and had to be more of a general practitioner. You're away from home. You're away from your doctors. You can't get in touch with your doctors. How do you get your medicine? You have different people of different age ranges, and how do you get your medicine? You have different people of different age ranges, and they have different requirements, and trying to be clear on what they need, where can they get it, how can they get their insurance information, whether that's in handy, whether they are covered, and all this kind of hoops that maybe don't always think about after a disaster, how to plan, or even preparing before. So if you can get several months worth of your prescription for, you don't need Oxy clearly for 3 months, but if you're on different medications for heart and whatever, then you can get a couple months worth and put that in your emergency pack when you're kind of planning for your emergency evacuation type activities to take with you because you may not have access to your medicine. You may be away from that source, your normal pharmacy, your doctors, what have you. So definitely important to think about when you're planning pharmacy, your doctors, what have you. So definitely important to think about when you're planning for a disaster. It's better to plan. If you don't plan, you plan to fail. There's some quote to that effect out there. Yeah, so she became more of a GP. She's getting people's prescriptions together, trying to help and get in where you fit in. So over the next year, and get to see all the same people and whatever. That's maybe most people's freshman year of college experience. It was every time I went home, we were living somewhere else. And to be clear, my family, we are blessed and fine and all good, but when your dad was challenging, it's why you save for the rainy days and all that kind of stuff. But one break, they were at a home in Houston. That was like the first break. It would have been probably Christmas break, home in Houston that they rented after they needed to kind of settle and take roots and not knowing what was going to be the state of New Orleans. Were they going to bring New Orleans? It's going to be the state of New Orleans. Were they going to bring New Orleans back with some discussions at the time? Would they just green space it all? Would they just green space certain sections that got really flooded really bad? So that would be maybe our home and kind of understanding what that meant. So they rented a home in Houston and we went and stayed there. My brother and I, maybe summer, spring break, something like that. My mom was in school at the time. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment was the next setup, which is fine when you have just 2 parents and a daughter. But yeah, when all 3 of your children come home and we're all adults-ish, grown size, not little kids. So that was challenging. Making space, and especially love my sister. She's in medical school in Nashville. Whoop whoop. Another doctor in the family, but she kicks when she sleeps. No shade, but shade. So that was an adventure. So that's second break every time you come home. I think it was spring or summer. So graduate housing, the next kind of adventure of being home and where are we living now is kind of the Russian roulette. Where do I need to go? So they were finally back in New Orleans. With the graduate housing, rent one side and kind of kept the other one as a vacation home as they lived in the West Coast. We stayed there after my grandparents we kind of did this like trailing, following them as far as them moving back into their home. So once they were able to move out of that home, it was like a duplex where they were on one side, the other side was rented out. It was like a duplex where they were on one side, the other side was rented out, wasn't affected with the flooding. So we lived there for a while. It was like a basic 2-bedroom, but they had a couple of sofa beds and all that in the main living space. So it all worked out. Ultimately, like I said, stuff is replaceable. I think I don't know how much of that, looking back, that I would have really necessitated or really thought about pre-Katrina, but definitely a way of life for me. I mean, have things. Don't be like, okay, stuff's replaceable, so I won't have anything. Have things you care about, know where they are. But know that if something happened tomorrow and I lost them, but it is what it is. I'm here. I have breath in my body. I have the ability to use my brain, move my limbs. That's enough. That's more than some people got. Somebody didn't wake up this morning. Somebody wishes they could walk. If your car breaks down on the highway, somebody wishes they could get out of their hospital. If your car breaks down on the highway, somebody wishes they could get out of their hospital bed and walk and just go for a lap walk to the mailbox. Those little things that oftentimes in the hustle and bustle that is the day-to-day life, we have a tendency to forget the important things. Forget the important things. What's important? The ability, I always think when I go to church here and anywhere I go and in the time of praise and worship, I used to do a lot more in the praise and worship space in my old church back in New Orleans. But I was like, look, if you need to think of a reason to praise the Lord, raise your hands. The ability to raise your hands is enough reason. There's always the old saying in the church of if he doesn't do another thing for me, he's already done enough. And he's already podcast. I'm here to talk to people. You're here. You have a purpose and a calling on your life. Whether you know what it is, that's between you and the Lord. And I would invite you and implore you to spend some time with God in prayerfulness and really having a conversation with God, to understand what that is for you. Because if you don't know your calling, it can be rough. A day-to-day life of not understanding what your why is one of the terms out in the ethers of life that I didn't make up. I don't know where it came from. But what's your why? Like, you come from where it came from. But what's your why? Like, you can work at McDonald's, you work at Walmart, you could work as a lawyer, doctor, health and safety, whatever. That's what you do. It's not your why. Why do I wake up every morning? What is my calling on my life? What am I put on this planet to do? And that's a point in which a lot of people struggle. Regardless of your beliefs, that's a point to really understand on your life. And if you don't know what that is, then it's hard. So for me, the calling on my life is I'm put on this planet to job every day, even if it's small to large, help people any way I can. I have a love for people, to help, to mentor, to really embrace and minister in a way. That's a ministry. Like, ministry doesn't have to be just in a way. That's a ministry. Like, ministry doesn't have to be just the fivefold ministry and in the church directly. You, as a Christian or a woman or man of God, you have a ministry. Your life is your ministry, and that purpose on your life is the more specific you're going to do your ministry. But even if your job is to clean up, that's a ministry. You do it joyfully, like you would do anything else. And people see that. People see, regardless of their own personal background, people see, and I get asked this all the time, maybe other people do, you're always so happy. You're always happy. Everything's not always great, but I try and put things in context and step back and say, what am I actually upset about? What can I change? And what's really important? Those are things to guide every guiding principle around anything in life. Every guiding principle around anything in life to really try and it's hard when you're in it. It's probably the biggest thing. And as you develop as a person and in your faith, to step back and say, but wait, there's something, and especially if you're of the Christian faith, and I implore you, of the Christian faith, and I implore you, if this speaks to you, find your nearest church and try and figure it out, or feel free to reach out to me, Monique at thevictorypodcast.com. I'm more than welcome to help put you in contact with some ministries in different parts of the country and the world. There's more there's a bigger power, in my belief that Jesus Christ is the Lord, is my Lord and Savior. But for you, it may be something different. But whoever that greater power is in your life, the God in your life, that's what we're here for. Either way, I believe it's the way, but ultimately it'll be what it is. So yeah, coming back to finally being able to move into our home was an amazing feeling. As far as, hey, look, I'm away at school, but to be home, I was lucky that my bedroom was upstairs and was relatively unscathed, but it was a challenge. So moving back, New Orleans was not 100% back. My dad was fighting tooth and nail to start going back. Like I said, his business was there, trying to rebuild that. And I'll link this in the show notes for the show. The challenge with Katrina, people are like, what's the deal? Because if you go to New Orleans today, it's not 100% back. It's not perfect. It's not everything done. All the places that you would want to visit as a tourist or a visitor to that city, it's fine. New Orleans, the French Quarter, great stuff. A lot of new things. Post Katrina, awesome stuff. Most amazing food in one of the most amazing cities, bar none, in the country. And I've been a few places. I won't say I've been everywhere, but it's just an amazing cultural melting pot of people and backgrounds and attitudes, and it's got that Southern hospitality with the backgrounds and attitudes, and it's got that Southern hospitality with a little bit of something extra too. All those kind of places, if you're going to visit, they're back. They weren't really heavily affected by Katrina. The challenge is if you live there, coming back from Katrina, if you imagine, and I'll send the link back from Katrina, if you imagine, and I'll send the link to my Uncle Rustin being interviewed for the 10-year anniversary, which was about almost 5 years ago now. Imagine a life in which your house caught on fire. If tomorrow your house caught on fire, it would probably be okay because your neighbors would be able to help you, your family members would be able to help you. It would be okay. It would be devastating for you personally, but it's a one-person effect in that sense, one family unit. Katrina was imagining as if everyone's house caught on fire at the same time. So who can you turn to? Your neighbors are going through the same thing. Your city's girls who live there, they're trying to figure out what they got to do. You know, as I mentioned, a family friend of mine was the police chief at the time. He's trying to figure out, is their family safe? Is their folks safe? And still try and find up to the citizens that they protect and serve. So those are things that it's challenging. And like I said, I imagine this whole experience is challenging. And like I said, I imagine this whole experience is somewhat equitable to the first responders experience in New York and people of New York, and some sisterhood there, or brotherhood, or whatever of those experiences. But it was, and it, you know, out of that has emerged a lot of great things. There's still some challenges that face New Orleans and the future of New Orleans. There was a lot of people who did not come back. There are pluses and minuses to any situation, right? There's always something to be gained. For a lot of people, it was an opportunity. If you're born and raised in New Orleans or Louisiana, you don't really know what you're missing out on. So when people who did evacuate or got, you know, pulled from roofs and whatever and survived and sent to places like Atlanta and Houston, regionally close areas, some said, I can make a life for myself here. The pay is often better in some of those places. It's a lot larger, especially pre-Katrina, a lot more industries located there, good paying jobs, opportunities, good infrastructure, better infrastructure than New Orleans has, or had at that time during Katrina. So yeah, it was a question of maybe I don't need to come back, and that's okay. And so there's a bit of that. And then people couldn't afford to come back, so they had to live where they are by choice or whatever. And then people who were working challenges of not knowing the state of the city. So it was a challenge. So that's a long-winded version of my Katrina story. I think I'm going to end up breaking this into 2 episodes. So that's the first one. So we'll do a 2-parter. So episode 4, part 1 is about the Katrina story. We'll record the second half around living abroad. What's that like? Canada's barely abroad, but enough that there are differences and nuances. And so I'll talk about that in part 2. Thanks for listening. So you've been listening to part 1 of episode 4, and thanks so much for listening. If you're looking to find out more about the Victory Podcast, check out our website at thevictorypodcast.com. That's TheVictory podcast, podcast, all one word, thevictorypodcast.com. That's got links to our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Of the 2, I spend the most time on Instagram and Facebook, so hit me up there. Always learn of information, thoughts, what have you. And you can also check us out via email if you want to ask me a question directly. Or have an idea, or someone you think might want to be on the show. It is challenging when you're starting a podcast to kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak. It is challenging when you're starting a podcast to kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak. Especially this kind of interview style of very personal, what can be very personal stories. So if you know somebody who has shared their story somewhere else, or you think would be willing to share, please shoot me a line, send me their contact info, Monique at the. So that's it for part 1. Thanks so much for listening. I'll end with my sign-off line. Every problem has a solution. It's whether you're willing to do the work to find it. Let's do the work and be victorious.